I'm Julia Bennett, 38 years old, and I went from being a disowned pregnant teenager to becoming a U.S. Army general. For years, I bent over backwards to please my parents, doing everything right, sacrificing friendships, even erasing myself to win their approval. But when I told them I was pregnant at 18, my father slammed the door in my face and my mother said she wished I'd never been born. That day, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been cut off, humiliated, or betrayed by the very people you gave everything to? If so, you're not alone. Drop your story in the comments. Before I share what happened, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit like and subscribe for more real stories about boundaries, resilience, and reclaiming your worth. What came next might surprise you. I grew up in a house where silence was safer than speaking. My parents, Thomas and Margaret Bennett, ran our lives like a carefully orchestrated performance. Everything had its place, everyone had their role, and deviation wasn't just discouraged, it was unthinkable. Our home sat on Maple Street in a town small enough that everyone knew everyone's business, which meant appearances mattered more than truth. My father worked as an accountant at the local firm. My mother volunteered at church and hosted book clubs. They were respected, admired even. And I was their dutiful daughter, the one who never caused problems. From the time I could understand expectations, I understood mine. Good grades weren't celebrated, they were assumed. Helping with dinner, watching my younger brother David, keeping my room spotless, these weren't acts of contribution but basic requirements. I learned early that love in our house came with conditions, though I didn't have words for it then. I just knew that when I pleased them, the air felt lighter. When I didn't, the cold silence could last for days. David was 4 years younger, and from the beginning, I became his second guardian. I walked him to school, helped with his homework, made sure he stayed out of trouble. My parents appreciated this, though they never said so directly. Appreciation came in the form of a nod, a brief smile, the absence of criticism. I became fluent in reading these subtle signals, adjusting my behavior to maintain peace. Sundays meant church. We sat in the same pew every week, 4th row from the front on the right side. My mother wore her pearl necklace, my father his navy suit. I wore dresses she selected, always modest, always appropriate. After service, we'd stand in the parking lot while my parents chatted with other families, presenting our unified front. The Bennetts. Respectable, religious, reliable. I stood quietly beside them, smiling when expected, speaking only when spoken to. Our dinner table was another stage. We ate at 6 o'clock sharp, always together, always formal. My father would ask about our days, but the questions felt more like inspections than genuine interest. My mother corrected my posture, my word choices, the way I held my fork. These weren't suggestions, they were adjustments to keep me aligned with their vision of who I should be. David got similar treatment, though being younger, he received slightly more patience. I learned to anticipate their corrections before they came, molding myself into what they wanted before they had to ask. The imbalance was there from the start, woven into the fabric of our family. I gave everything, my time, my energy, my obedience. I sacrificed friendships because certain kids weren't from the right families. I abandoned hobbies my mother deemed frivolous. I studied subjects that would lead to respectable careers, not ones I actually enjoyed. And in return, I received conditional affection. When I performed well, met expectations, stayed invisible in my compliance, things were smooth. But I learned quickly that their love had a price, and that price was my complete submission to their standards. My teenage years intensified this dynamic. While other girls my age tested boundaries, I reinforced mine. I came home by curfew, actually, 15 minutes before curfew. I dressed conservatively. I joined clubs my mother approved of, debate team, volunteer corps, student council. These activities looked good on college applications, which was what mattered. My parents had decided I would attend the state university, major in business or education, marry someone appropriate, and continue their legacy of respectability. I wanted to please them. That was the painful truth of it. Despite everything, I believed that if I just tried hard enough, if I was just good enough, I would finally earn the unconditional love I sensed other families had naturally. I watched my classmates' parents at school events, saw how they hugged their children without stiffness, how they laughed at their kids' jokes, how pride radiated from them without their children having to earn it first. I wanted that. So I kept trying. When I was 16, I won a regional science fair. I'd spent months on my project, working late nights in the garage, driven by genuine curiosity about environmental chemistry. The judges praised my research, my presentation, my innovative approach. I brought home the trophy, a beautiful glass award that caught the light and threw rainbows across the wall. I set it on the dinner table that night, waiting for my parents' reaction. My father glanced at it. "That's fine. Now go set the table properly." My mother added, "Don't let this go to your head. Pride comes before a fall." That was it. No celebration, no recognition, no acknowledgement that I'd accomplished something significant. Just a reminder to stay humble, stay small, stay in my assigned place. I put the trophy in my room where it gathered dust, a symbol of effort that would never be enough. David noticed things I tried not to see. One night, when I was helping him with algebra, he asked why I always did everything Mom and Dad wanted. He was 12, still young enough to ask honest questions without fear. I told him it was what good daughters did. He looked at me with confusion, like he couldn't understand why that meant erasing yourself completely. I changed the subject. The weekends were structured around family activities that looked perfect from the outside. We'd visit relatives, attend community events, go to the same restaurant where my parents knew the owners. Every outing was an opportunity to reinforce our image. My mother would remind me before we left the house to smile, to be polite, to remember we represented the family. The pressure to perform was constant, exhausting. I learned to switch into public mode automatically, presenting the version of myself they'd crafted while burying everything else deeper. At school, I maintained high marks and stayed out of drama. Teachers liked me because I was responsible and quiet. I had friends, but kept them at arm's length, never bringing them home, never letting them see the reality behind our perfect facade. I was good at compartmentalizing by then, at keeping different parts of my life separate. It was the only way to survive the contradiction of being myself at school while being their creation at home. By 17, I'd perfected the art of invisible rebellion. I'd think my own thoughts, but never speak them. I'd feel my own feelings, but never show them. I'd dream my own dreams, but never pursue them. This internal compromise felt like survival, though looking back, it was slow suffocation. I was becoming a ghost in my own life, present but not really there, going through motions while my authentic self retreated further into hiding. Then I met Ryan Clark, and everything I'd carefully constructed began to crack. Ryan worked at the auto shop where my father took our car for maintenance. I noticed him first, tall, with dark hair and grease under his fingernails, laughing with a coworker while they worked on an engine. There was an ease about him, a comfort in his own skin that I'd never experienced. When our eyes met, he smiled, and something in my chest tightened. We started talking during those oil changes and tire rotations. Small conversations at first, about music and movies and nothing important. But those nothing conversations felt like everything to me. Ryan listened when I spoke, actually listened, not just waiting for his turn to talk or to correct me. He asked questions about what I thought, what I wanted, who I was beneath the good girl exterior. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. My parents noticed him during one visit. Afterward, in the car, my mother made her position clear. "That boy at the garage was looking at you inappropriately." "He was just being friendly," I said quietly. "Friendly." My father's voice was flat. "He's a mechanic, Julia. Not someone you need to encourage." The message was obvious. Ryan wasn't from the right family, didn't have the right prospects, wouldn't fit into their carefully designed future for me. I should have listened. I should have stayed away. But something in me, some part that had been compressed too long, pushed back. I started finding excuses to stop by the garage. Just for a few minutes, just to talk. Ryan was easy to be around, never demanding, never judging. He talked about his dreams of opening his own shop someday, about traveling, about actually living instead of just existing. When I told him about the science fair trophy gathering dust, He asked why I'd stopped pursuing that passion. I didn't have a good answer. Our relationship developed slowly, hidden from my parents. We'd meet at the library where I supposedly studied late. We'd talk in his truck parked behind the grocery store. Everything was careful, calculated to avoid detection. The secrecy should have been a warning, a sign that I was building something on an unstable foundation. But I was 18, and for the first time in my life, someone really saw me, and wanted me anyway. My mother's criticism sharpened that year. My clothing was too casual, too tight, too bright, too dull. My friends were questionable. My attitude was changing. She started watching me more carefully, as if she could sense the rebellion brewing beneath my compliant surface. Margaret Bennett had built her entire identity around being the perfect wife and mother, and any crack in that facade threatened her sense of self. I was becoming a crack. My father's expectations grew more rigid. He'd mapped out my entire college career, business degree, internships at respectable firms, graduation into a position that would reflect well on the family. When I mentioned possibly studying environmental science, he dismissed it immediately. That's not a real career. You need something stable, respectable. We didn't raise you to chase pipe dreams. The word raised caught in my throat. They'd shaped me, molded me, controlled me, but raised me? That implied nurturing, supporting, helping me grow into myself. They'd done the opposite, pruning away anything that didn't fit their vision until I was barely recognizable to myself. At family gatherings, the subtle humiliations increased. My aunt would ask about my plans, and before I could answer, my mother would interject with the approved version. My accomplishments were downplayed while David's minor achievements were celebrated. I was expected to help serve food, clear plates, and entertain younger cousins while my brother socialized freely. The double standard was obvious to everyone except, apparently, my parents. Margaret began rewriting our history in conversations with relatives. She'd mention how I'd always been difficult, stubborn, prone to making poor choices. I'd sit there, stunned, listening to her revise years of my obedient compliance into a narrative of rebellious troublemaking. It was gaslighting before I knew the term, a subtle erasure of reality designed to justify increased control. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner where my mother criticized everything from my hair to my choice of vegetables, I asked her directly, "Why is nothing I do ever good enough?" She looked at me with genuine confusion. "What are you talking about? We have very reasonable expectations. I meet every expectation. I always have. But you never acknowledge it. We don't praise you for doing what you're supposed to do," my father said. "That's just basic responsibility." There it was. The truth laid bare. In their worldview, meeting expectations wasn't achievement, it was baseline. There was no winning, no moment of arrival when I'd finally be enough. The goalpost would always move, the bar always rise, because conditional love required constant conditions. Ryan gave me something different. With him, I could breathe. I could laugh without worrying if it was too loud. I could express opinions without immediate correction. I could just be. It wasn't perfect. We were young, figuring things out, building something without any model for healthy love. But it felt like freedom after years of captivity. My parents sensed the shift. Their control was slipping, and they responded by tightening their grip. More questions about where I'd been, who I'd seen, what I'd done. More rules, more restrictions, more consequences for infractions I didn't understand. The house became a surveillance state, with me as the perpetual suspect. I started planning my escape. College would be my exit, my chance to finally live on my own terms. Just one more year, I told myself. One more year of playing their game, and then I'd be free. It was a reasonable plan, a safe plan. But life had other ideas. I found out I was pregnant on a Tuesday in March. The test sat on the bathroom counter, 2 pink lines that changed everything. I was 18, 2 months from graduation, with college applications already submitted. My carefully constructed exit strategy shattered in an instant. For 3 days, I carried the secret alone. I'd wake up nauseous, force down breakfast while my mother commented on my pale complexion, then spend first period in the school bathroom trying not to vomit. Ryan noticed something was wrong, but I wasn't ready to tell him. I wasn't ready to tell anyone. I kept hoping I'd wake up and it would be a mistake, a false positive, a nightmare I could escape. But the test was accurate, and the reality was unavoidable. When I finally told Ryan, we sat in his truck behind the abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. He went quiet, staring out the windshield at nothing. Then he asked what I wanted to do. It was the right question, the respectful question, but I didn't have an answer. Everything I'd planned, every future I'd imagined, even the ones I'd dreamed in secret, none of them included this. We talked for hours. Ryan said he'd support whatever I decided. He wasn't ready to be a father, admitted it honestly, but he wouldn't run. We were young, scared, completely unprepared. But underneath the fear, I felt something else, a strange, unexpected determination. This baby was mine. Not my parents to control, not society's to judge. Mine. The hardest part was telling my parents. I rehearsed the conversation dozens of times, trying to find words that would make them understand, that would activate whatever parental love existed beneath their obsession with appearances. I chose a Sunday afternoon after church, when they were usually in better moods. I asked them to sit down in the living room. My father's face already showed irritation. I was disrupting the schedule. I told them directly, I'm pregnant. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, suffocating, filled with everything they weren't saying. My mother's face went white, then red. My father stood up slowly, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. How far along? Margaret's voice was ice. 8 weeks. Who's the father? Ryan Clark. My father's laugh was bitter. The mechanic. Of course. We told you to stay away from him. I love him, I said, though I wasn't sure if that was true or just what I thought I should feel. Love. My mother spat the word like poison. You don't know anything about love. You've ruined your life. You've ruined our reputation. Everyone will know. Everyone will see what you've done. Not what happened, not this situation, what I'd done. As if pregnancy was something I'd done to them, a deliberate attack on their standing in the community. My father moved toward the door, opened it. Get out. I didn't understand at first. What? Get out of my house. You're not my daughter anymore. My mother stood, her face twisted with something between rage and disgust. You're dead to me, my father said. The words came out calm, final. Then my mother added, I wish we never had you. The floor dropped out from under me. I'd expected anger, disappointment, maybe even temporary rejection. But this was complete severance, immediate and absolute. No discussion of options, no offer of support, no moment of parental concern for my well-being. Just expulsion. You're kicking me out? My voice sounded distant, disconnected from my body. You made your choice. My father's face was stone. Now live with it. I looked at my mother, searching for any crack in her resolve, any hint of the woman who'd raised me. But Margaret Bennett had already rewritten the story. I wasn't her daughter anymore. I was a problem to be removed, a stain to be erased. David appeared at the top of the stairs, his face confused and frightened. What's happening? Go to your room, my father commanded without looking at him. I grabbed my jacket and purse, moving on autopilot. This couldn't be real. Parents didn't do this. Not over one mistake, not with this much speed and finality. But as I stepped onto the porch and heard the door slam behind me, lock clicking into place, reality crashed down. I stood there for several minutes, expecting the door to reopen, expecting someone to call me back. It didn't happen. Through the window, I could see my mother on the phone, probably already doing damage control with relatives and church friends. My father sat in his chair, reading the newspaper as if nothing significant had occurred. They'd removed me from their lives as easily as throwing out trash. The neighbors were watching. Mrs. Peterson across the street pretended to water plants that didn't need watering. Mr. Chen slowed his lawn mowing to observe. By tomorrow, the entire town would know. Julia Bennett, the perfect daughter, got herself pregnant and was thrown out. The shame would be cast on me alone, while my parents played the victims of a rebellious, ungrateful child. I walked to Ryan's apartment 3 miles away. He took one look at my face and pulled me inside. I told him what happened, the words coming out mechanical and flat. He held me while I sat there, not crying, not feeling anything except a vast, empty numbness where my family used to be. That night, lying on Ryan's couch, I stared at the ceiling and tried to process the betrayal. 18 years of obedience, sacrifice, and compliance, and they'd discarded me in minutes. Everything I'd given, all the ways I'd shaped myself to earn their love, meant nothing. I'd been so busy trying to be enough that I'd never realized I was never going to be. Their love wasn't conditional. It didn't exist at all. What existed was approval of my performance, and the moment I stopped performing to their standards, I ceased to matter. The cruelty wasn't just the rejection. It was how easy it was for them. No struggle, no torn loyalty, no painful decision. Just a clean cut, simple and surgical. After everything, I meant nothing to them. The first week alone was the hardest. Ryan let me stay in his apartment, a cramped one-bedroom above a laundromat. The sound of washing machines hummed through the floor at all hours. I'd lie awake at night, hand on my still flat stomach, trying to figure out how I'd gotten here. Everything I'd planned, college, career, escape, was gone. In its place was a blank, terrifying future. Ryan tried to help, but he was struggling too. At 20, he was barely supporting himself. Adding a pregnant girlfriend strained his resources and patience. We didn't fight, not exactly, but tension filled the small space. He'd come home from the garage exhausted, and I'd be there, still in the same clothes, having accomplished nothing all day except surviving. I needed a job. The pregnancy wasn't showing yet, which helped. I applied everywhere: retail stores, restaurants, offices. Most places didn't call back. The ones that did asked about my education, my experience, my references. I couldn't list my parents. I had no professional history beyond school activities. I was 18, pregnant, and completely unqualified for anything that paid enough to matter. I finally got hired at a diner called Rosie's, working breakfast and lunch shifts. The pay was minimum wage, the work was exhausting, and the owner, Rosie herself, was a sharp-eyed woman who missed nothing. But she gave me a chance when no one else would, and I was grateful for it. The diner became my refuge. There was something soothing about the routine, taking orders, serving food, clearing tables, repeating. My feet ached by the end of shifts, and I smelled like grease and coffee, but it was honest work. No performance required, no image to maintain. Just show up, do the job, go home. Rosie figured out I was pregnant before I told her. One morning, I ran to the bathroom to throw up during the rush. When I came out, pale and shaking, she handed me crackers and ginger ale. Morning sickness, she said matter-of-factly. Take 5 minutes, then get back out there. That was it. No judgment, no prying questions, just practical acknowledgement and support. It was more than my own mother had offered. My parents' rejection rippled through the community. At the grocery store, women who'd known me since childhood looked through me like I was invisible. At the library, the clerk who'd always been friendly suddenly became cold and efficient. The town had chosen sides, and my parents' version of events, ungrateful, rebellious daughter who'd thrown away her future, was the one people believed. Only a few people reached out. My old debate coach, Mrs. Patterson, called to check on me. She didn't offer judgment or advice, just let me know someone cared. David tried calling once, but when my father found out, he disconnected the line and forbade further contact. My brother was 14, powerless against their control. I didn't blame him for his silence. Ryan and I lasted 3 more months. The strain of my pregnancy, his financial stress, and our fundamental unreadiness for parenthood eroded whatever connection we'd had. He wasn't cruel about it, he just couldn't handle it. One night, he told me he was moving to another state for a better job opportunity, and while I could come, he didn't think we should. It was honest, at least. He'd tried, and he couldn't do it. I watched him pack, feeling nothing. Another person leaving, another connection severed. After Ryan left, I moved into a studio apartment that cost too much and offered too little. 1 room, a bathroom, a kitchenette. The walls were thin enough to hear neighbors arguing, music playing, lives continuing around me while mine seemed suspended. I worked at the diner, came home exhausted, ate whatever was cheap, and tried not to think about the future. That's when I met Captain James Harris. He came into Rosie's every Tuesday and Thursday, always ordered the same thing, black coffee and wheat toast. He wore his uniform crisp and perfect, and he tipped well. We didn't talk beyond basic pleasantries for weeks. Then one morning, when the diner was slow, he asked me a question that changed everything. "You in school?" "Not anymore," I said, refilling his coffee. "Planning to go back?" I shrugged. "Can't really afford it now." He studied me for a moment. "You look like someone trying to figure out her next move." "I'm just trying to get through today." "That's a start," he said. "But eventually, you'll need more than just survival." Something in his tone made me stop, really look at him. He wasn't judging or pitying. He was assessing, the way someone might evaluate potential. "Have you ever considered the military?" he asked. I almost laughed. "No." "Why not?" "I'm pregnant." "Now, yes. But after?" "Military offers structure, training, education benefits, childcare support. It's not easy, but it's a real path forward." I mumbled something non-committal and moved to another table, but the seed was planted. The military. It seemed impossible, ridiculous even. But over the next few days, the idea grew. Structure appealed to me after months of chaos. Purpose, direction, a clear framework. I'd lived most of my life trying to meet other people's expectations. Maybe I could redirect that tendency towards something that would actually benefit me. Captain Harris became a regular presence. He'd ask about my plans, share information about different military branches, answer questions I was too embarrassed to ask officially. He never pushed, never made promises about easy solutions. He just offered information and let me decide. The clarity I gained during those months was painful but necessary. I looked back at my 18 years with my parents and saw the pattern clearly. I'd given everything: obedience, loyalty, sacrifice, love. I'd shaped myself into their image, suppressed my own desires, lived for their approval. And they'd taken it all as their due, never recognizing the cost, never reciprocating with genuine, unconditional love. The moment I failed to meet their standards, they discarded me without hesitation. That realization could have broken me. Instead, it hardened something inside. If I'd been strong enough to maintain that level of discipline for people who didn't deserve it, I could redirect that strength toward building something for myself. I couldn't change what my parents had done, but I could choose what I did next. I started researching military options seriously. The Army offered the most comprehensive benefits for single parents. There were programs, support systems, paths forward. It wouldn't be easy, but nothing about my life was easy anymore. At least this way, the difficulty would be meaningful. My daughter was born on a cold November night. Labor was long and painful, and I went through it alone. No Ryan, no parents, no family. Just me and the nurses who rotated through their shifts with professional kindness. When they placed her in my arms, this tiny, wrinkled creature who was entirely dependent on me, I felt terror and love in equal measure. I named her Olivia. No family names, no inherited connections. She was mine, a fresh start, unburdened by the past. For months after Olivia was born, I enlisted in the Army. The decision came with logistics that seemed impossible: finding childcare, arranging finances, preparing for basic training. Captain Harris helped navigate the bureaucracy, connecting me with programs designed for single parents. The military, whatever its flaws, understood that people came with complications. My parents didn't know. They'd made no attempt to contact me during my pregnancy or after Olivia's birth. I'd become a ghost to them, erased from their narrative. Extended family followed their lead, either out of genuine agreement or fear of Thomas and Margaret's judgment. The few relatives who might have wanted to help stayed silent, unwilling to risk being cast out themselves. I learned that loyalty in my family was conditional for everyone, not just me. Basic training was brutal. I'd thought I understood hard work, discipline, sacrifice. I was wrong. The military demanded more than compliance, it demanded transformation. Physical training pushed me past limits I didn't know I had. Mental challenges required focus and resilience I had to build from scratch. And all of it happened while I worried about Olivia, cared for by a military family services provider, growing and changing without me there to see it. but I'd found my element. The structure I'd craved, the clear expectations, the merit-based advancement, it all made sense to me. When I succeeded, I was recognized. When I failed, I was told how to improve. There was no moving goalpost, no hidden agenda, no conditional love disguised as guidance. Just standards, effort, and results. I called to check on Olivia every chance I got. The provider, a kind woman named Sandra whose husband was deployed overseas, sent photos and updates. Olivia was thriving, hitting milestones, developing into a person with her own personality. Missing those moments hurt, but I was building something for both of us. A future with stability, opportunity, security. The sacrifice had to be worth it. During rare quiet moments, I'd think about my parents. Did they wonder where I was? Did they ever regret their choice? Probably not. Thomas and Margaret Bennett had convinced themselves they'd done the right thing, the moral thing. Their daughter had failed them, brought shame on the family, and deserved consequences. They'd tell that story to anyone who'd listen, cementing their victim status while I became the cautionary tale. The estrangement was complete. No letters, no calls, no attempts at reconciliation. They'd made their choice, and I'd accepted it. More than accepted it, I'd used it as fuel. Every brutal training session, every moment of exhaustion and doubt, I channeled my anger and hurt into determination. They'd thrown me away, believing I'd fail, expecting me to become another small-town tragedy. I'd prove them wrong by succeeding beyond anything they'd imagined. Ryan's absence was different. He'd left out of weakness, not cruelty. He sent occasional checks in the first year, token amounts that barely helped but proved he hadn't completely abandoned his responsibility. Then the check stopped, and I assumed he'd moved on entirely. I didn't chase him. Olivia and I would be fine without him. Advanced training came next. I'd shown aptitude for leadership, for strategy, for the kind of clear-headed decision-making that served well in high-pressure situations. My instructors noticed. They started pushing me toward officer training, suggesting paths I'd never considered. The scared 18-year-old living above a laundromat seemed like a different person from a different life. I made friends in the military, real friends who knew my story and didn't judge. Women who'd overcome their own challenges, who understood the particular struggle of balancing service and motherhood. They shared resources, advice, encouragement. For the first time since my parents' rejection, I felt part of something larger than myself, connected to people who had my back without conditions attached. Olivia adapted better than I'd feared. Military childcare was structured but nurturing, and she bonded with other kids whose parents were serving. When I had leave, we'd spend every moment together. I'd read to her, play with her, try to compress weeks of parenting into days. It wasn't ideal, but it was what we had, and we made it work. My parents' lives, from what little I heard through the small-town gossip network, were changing too. My father's accounting firm lost major clients during an economic downturn. Their carefully maintained middle-class status slipped. Nothing dramatic, just a gradual decline in circumstances and social standing. The church they'd attended so faithfully had a scandal involving the pastor, and membership dwindled. The community image they'd protected so fiercely lost its power as the community itself changed. David reached out once, years later, through social media. He was 17, about to leave for college. His message was brief, apologetic, explaining he'd wanted to contact me sooner, but couldn't until he was old enough to defy our parents. We exchanged a few messages, but the connection felt strained. We were strangers connected only by shared DNA and a traumatic past. I wished him well and let the conversation fade. I didn't seek revenge against my parents. I didn't need to. My success was enough. Every promotion, every commendation, every achievement was proof that their judgment had been wrong. I'd built a life not despite their rejection but, in some ways, because of it. Their cruelty had forced me to develop strengths I might never have discovered otherwise. Years passed. Olivia grew from toddler to child to young teenager. I rose through the ranks steadily, earning respect through competence and leadership. The military became my family, my identity, my purpose. General Bennett, when I finally achieved that rank, I'd spent a moment thinking about how my parents would react if they knew. Then I'd moved on. Their opinions didn't matter anymore. 20 years after they'd slammed the door in my face, my parents stood at the gate of my estate. I watched them through the security monitor, these two elderly people who'd once held absolute power over my life now reduced to uncertain visitors. The guard's voice came through the speaker. "Ma'am, there are two people here asking to see you. They say they're your parents. Thomas and Margaret Bennett." I studied their faces on the screen. They'd aged. Thomas's hair was completely white, his posture stooped. Margaret looked smaller, diminished, her face lined with years of stress. They looked nervous, out of place, intimidated by the setting. The estate I'd purchased 3 years earlier sat on 10 acres outside the city, a modest mansion by some standards, but a world away from the middle-class home they'd raised me in. "Do you have an appointment?" the guard asked them, following protocol. Thomas shook his head. "No, we were hoping to speak with General Bennett. We're her parents." The title clearly shocked them. General Bennett. Not Julia, their disowned daughter, but General Bennett, a woman who'd built something significant from the ashes of their rejection. The guard looked at the monitor, waiting for my instruction. I could have turned them away. Would have been justified, even. 2 decades of silence, and now they appeared, wanting what? Reconciliation? Money? The satisfaction of seeing what I'd become? I pressed the intercom button. "Let them in. I'll meet them in the front room." Olivia appeared beside me, now 18 herself, preparing for college. She'd grown into a confident, intelligent young woman who knew her grandmother and grandfather only as cautionary tales. "You sure about this?" she asked. "No," I admitted. "But I need to hear what they want." I'd prepared for this possibility, though I'd never been certain it would happen. Over the years, as my success became more public, I'd wondered if they'd reach out. Military promotions were published. My name appeared in newspapers. If they'd looked, they could have found me. That they'd waited this long told me everything about their motivation. They walked into my home slowly, taking in the high ceilings, the expensive furniture, the visible markers of success. I watched their faces register shock, discomfort, maybe even shame. This wasn't what they'd expected. They'd thrown out a pregnant teenager expecting her to fail, to validate their judgment. Instead, she'd become someone they had to look up to, literally and figuratively. "Julia," Margaret said, her voice wavering. "General Bennett," I corrected gently but firmly. "Julia was your daughter. She ceased to exist 20 years ago." Thomas cleared his throat. "We'd like to talk, if you'll let us." I gestured to the sitting area. We sat in uncomfortable silence for a moment. They looked small in the large room, diminished by their own choices. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt nothing, or maybe everything I'd refused to feel for 2 decades, compressed into a quiet, manageable distance. "Why are you here?" I asked directly. Margaret spoke first. "We've been thinking about you. About what happened." What happened?" I interrupted. "You mean when you threw your pregnant daughter into the street? When you told her she was dead to you? When you erased her from your life without a second thought?" Thomas flinched. "We were angry. We'd had expectations, and I failed to meet them." "Yes, I understand. I spent my entire childhood meeting your expectations. Perfect grades, perfect behavior, perfect compliance. Until I wasn't perfect anymore. Then I was nothing." "We thought you'd ruin your life," Margaret said quietly. "We thought you needed to face consequences." I did face consequences. I faced them alone at 18 with no family, no support, no safety net. I raised my daughter while building a career from nothing. Those were consequences. They looked at Olivia, who stood in the doorway watching with calm assessment. Margaret's face showed something that might have been regret or might have been self-pity. "We have a granddaughter." "You had a granddaughter," I corrected. "You chose not to know her. That was your decision." The conversation continued in circles. They offered explanations that sounded like excuses, apologies that felt hollow, justifications for rejections that had no justification. They mentioned their own hardships, financial struggles, health issues, David's estrangement. They implied, without stating directly, that they could use help. From me. From the daughter they'd disowned. I listened without interrupting. Let them say everything they'd come to say. When they finished, I spoke clearly and calmly. I appreciate you coming here. I needed to hear you acknowledge what you did, even if you still don't understand why it was wrong. But I want to be clear about something. I've built a life without you. Not against you, without you. Your rejection forced me to become strong, independent, and self-reliant. I'm grateful for those qualities, even if I'm not grateful for how I acquired them. Thomas leaned forward. We'd like to be part of your life now. If you'll let us. Why? I asked simply. The question hung in the air. They looked at each other, and I saw the truth in their hesitation. They wanted back in, but not because they'd genuinely changed, not because they'd learned to love unconditionally. They wanted in because my success was impressive, because I had resources they needed, because being connected to General Bennett was better for their image than being estranged from her. Because you're our daughter, Margaret finally said. I was your daughter. You terminated that relationship. You can't just reinstate it because circumstances changed. So you're saying no? Thomas's voice held an edge of the old authority, the tone that once would have made me comply immediately. I'm saying I need to think about what, if anything, I'm willing to offer. But let me be absolutely clear about the terms. If there is any future contact between us, it will be on my conditions. Limited. Respectful. With firm boundaries that you will honor. We're your parents, Margaret protested. You deserve nothing, I said, my voice still calm but steel hard. You gave up parental rights the moment you chose your reputation over your daughter. Anything I choose to give you from this point forward is grace, not obligation. The shift in power was complete and visible. They'd come expecting something, maybe easy forgiveness, maybe financial help, maybe just access to my success. Instead, they'd found a woman who'd moved beyond needing their approval. I wasn't the desperate teenager they'd discarded. I was someone who'd survived their worst and built something remarkable from the rubble. I stood, signaling the meeting's end. I have your contact information. If I decide limited communication is possible, I'll reach out. Until then, don't come here again unannounced. Thomas started to argue, but Margaret put her hand on his arm, stopping him. They'd lost the authority they once held, and some part of them recognized it. They stood slowly, looking around the room one last time, perhaps seeing the life they could have been part of if they'd made different choices. As they walked to the door, Margaret turned back. We did love you, Julia. We didn't know how to handle. You loved the version of me that obeyed. That's not the same as loving me. I opened the door. Goodbye. After they left, Olivia came and stood beside me. We watched their car disappear down the long driveway. How do you feel? She asked. I don't know yet. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. They seemed desperate. They are. That's what happens when the world you built on appearances and control crumbles. You have nothing left. Do you think you'll see them again? I considered the question honestly. Maybe. On my terms, if at all. But they'll never be my parents again. That door closed a long time ago. Olivia hugged me, and I held my daughter close, grateful beyond words for her. She was the reason I'd survived that first terrible year. She was the purpose that kept me moving when everything seemed impossible. My parents had seen her as shame, as failure, as something to hide. I'd seen her as hope. The rest of that day felt strange, unsettled. I went through motions, work calls, reviewing documents, normal activities, but part of my mind stayed with the encounter. I'd imagined their return hundreds of times over the years, scripted different versions of what I'd say, how I'd feel. The reality was quieter than my imagination, less dramatic but somehow heavier. That night, I sat in my office and thought about the past 20 years. The struggles, the victories, the moments of doubt and determination. I'd built a career, raised a daughter, created a life defined by my own choices and values. My parents' rejection had been brutal, but it had also been clarifying. It had forced me to answer a fundamental question. Could I survive without their approval? The answer had been yes. More than survive, I'd thrived. Not because I was extraordinary, but because I'd refused to let their judgment define my worth. I'd redirected all that energy I'd spent seeking their approval toward building something real and meaningful. Every time I'd wanted to quit, every time the weight of single parenthood and military demands felt crushing, I'd remembered that they'd expected me to fail. That memory became fuel instead of poison. In the weeks following my parents' visit, I made a decision about future contact. I would allow limited, structured communication, brief phone calls on major holidays, supervised visits a few times a year if they proved they could respect boundaries. Not because they deserved it, but because I wanted to model for Olivia what healthy boundaries looked like. I wanted her to see that you could acknowledge shared history without allowing toxic people to cause harm. The first supervised visit happened 2 months later, at a neutral location, a restaurant where we could have a meal and conversation with a defined beginning and end. They arrived nervous, overdressed, trying too hard. I came with Olivia, who'd agreed to meet her grandparents with appropriate caution. The conversation was stilted, surface level. They asked about my career, and I gave brief, professional answers. They tried to bond with Olivia, who was polite but distant. When Thomas started offering unsolicited advice about my life choices, I stopped him immediately. We're not doing that. This relationship, if it exists at all, isn't about your approval or guidance. It's about basic, respectful connection. Nothing more. He bristled but backed down. Margaret looked sad, perhaps realizing the full extent of what they'd lost. Not just a daughter, but 2 decades of relationship, memories, connection. They'd missed my entire adult life, my struggles and triumphs, my daughter's childhood, everything that mattered. They'd chosen their pride and image over all of that, and now they had to live with the consequences. Over the following year, we settled into a pattern. Occasional, brief phone calls. 2 or 3 visits per year, always structured, always with clear time limits. They learned not to overstep, not to make demands, not to expect intimacy we didn't have. It wasn't reconciliation, not really. It was managed contact, carefully controlled to prevent harm while acknowledging our shared past. David reached out again during this time, now in his 30s with a family of his own. He'd maintained distance from our parents, dealing with his own trauma from growing up in their controlling household. We met for coffee, and the conversation was easier than I'd expected. He apologized for not standing up for me when I was expelled, though he'd been just a kid. I told him I'd never blamed him. They ruined our family, he said quietly. Their obsession with appearances, their conditional love, it destroyed everything. They revealed what was already there, I corrected. The dysfunction was always present. My pregnancy just made it visible. David asked about my life, genuinely interested, not just being polite. I told him about the military, about Olivia, about the path I'd built from nothing. He shared his own story of leaving home at 18, cutting contact for years, slowly rebuilding on his own terms. We'd both had to escape to survive. Do you think they've changed? He asked. No. They've just lost the power they once had. That's not the same as growth or understanding. They're older, weaker, more dependent. That's why they came back, not because they love me, but because they need me. And you're okay with that? I'm okay with reality. They're who they are. I can't change them, and I've stopped wanting to. I can only control my own responses, my own boundaries. My relationship with my parents never became warm. There was no tearful reunion, no heartfelt apologies that led to healing. They remained fundamentally the same people, concerned with appearances, uncomfortable with emotions, unable to acknowledge their failures honestly. But I'd changed. I no longer needed their validation or feared their rejection. I'd built my own foundation, and nothing they did or didn't do could shake it. Olivia watched all of this with intelligent observation. She asked thoughtful questions about forgiveness, boundaries, family obligation. I tried to answer honestly, showing her that relationships could be complex, that you could acknowledge family connections without sacrificing your own well-being, that love without respect was hollow. Do you regret letting them back in? She asked one day. No, but I also don't regret the boundaries I've kept. They're my parents biologically, but they're not my family in the way that matters. You're my family. The people I served with are my family. The friends who showed up when everything was falling apart, they're my family. Biology is just biology. She nodded, understanding. At 18, preparing for college herself, she was developing her own sense of what family meant. She'd grown up seeing my strength and independence, but also my willingness to show mercy within firm limits. I hoped I'd taught her to value herself, to set boundaries, to never accept conditional love as a substitute for the real thing. General Bennett, the title still felt surreal sometimes, had responsibilities that extended beyond my personal life. I commanded respect, led troops, made decisions that affected hundreds of people. My reputation was built on competence, integrity, and the kind of leadership that inspired rather than intimidated. People under my command knew I was fair, demanding but supportive, clear about expectations while being invested in their success. The military had given me what my family never did, a meritocracy where performance mattered more than appearance, where loyalty was earned through actions rather than demanded through blood ties. I'd found purpose in service, in leading others, in building something larger than myself. The scared teenager who'd been thrown out of her parents' house had become a woman other people looked up to and trusted. My parents' declining years unfolded predictably. Health issues mounted, finances tightened, their world contracted. They'd alienated most of their social network through years of judgment and superiority. The few relatives who still maintained contact did so out of obligation rather than genuine affection. They'd built their lives on a foundation of appearances and control, and when those crumbled, nothing solid remained underneath. I helped them financially when necessary, not out of love, but out of basic human decency. I arranged for medical care, ensured they had adequate housing, covered expenses they couldn't manage. But I did it through lawyers and assistants, maintaining distance, never allowing them to mistake my practical support for emotional investment. They were elderly people who needed help. I had resources. That was the extent of it. Margaret called one Christmas, her voice weak and trembling, asking if we could visit. I agreed, bringing Olivia with me. Their home, a small apartment in a senior community, was neat but sparse, filled with echoes of the life they'd lost. Photos on the wall showed David and me as children, frozen in time before everything shattered. No photos of Olivia, no acknowledgement of the 2 decades they'd missed. The visit was brief and melancholy. Thomas, confined to a wheelchair after a stroke, looked at me with something that might have been pride or might have been regret. Margaret fussed over Olivia, trying to play the grandmother role 2 decades too late. Olivia was kind but not warm, present but not connected. As we prepared to leave, Margaret gripped my hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For everything." It was the first direct apology she'd ever offered. I looked at her, this frail, elderly woman who'd once held such power over my life, and felt nothing but sad distance. "I know," I said simply. Because she probably was sorry, in her limited way. Sorry that things hadn't worked out as she'd planned. Sorry that her choices had consequences. Sorry that she'd lost something she'd thrown away. But not sorry in the way that mattered. Not the kind of sorry that came from genuine understanding of the harm she'd caused. We left shortly after. In the car, Olivia asked, "Do you think that apology meant anything?" "It meant something to her. That's enough." "Not to you." I made peace with their failure to love me properly years ago. An apology now doesn't change the past. It doesn't undo the harm or erase the years I spent building myself back up. It's just words. That sounds really sad. It is sad. But it's also reality. Some relationships can't be repaired, no matter how much time passes or how many apologies are offered. The damage goes too deep. Olivia was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad you're my mom. I'm glad you're my daughter." That was the truth that mattered. Not the family I'd been born into, but the family I'd created. Not the love I'd begged for as a child, but the love I'd built as an adult. My parents had given me life, but they'd also tried to define its limits. Breaking free from those limits had been the most painful and most necessary thing I'd ever done. Thomas died 2 years later. Heart failure, sudden and mostly peaceful. David called to tell me, his voice flat and exhausted. There would be a small funeral. Did I want to come? I did, more for David than for our father. Olivia decided not to attend. She'd never had a relationship with him and saw no point in performing grief she didn't feel. The funeral was sparsely attended. A handful of elderly neighbors, some distant relatives, David and his family, Margaret and me. The pastor gave a generic eulogy about a man he'd barely known. No one shared personal stories. There weren't many worth sharing. Afterward, Margaret looked at me with desperate eyes. "You'll still help me? Even with him gone?" "Yes," I said. "I'll make sure you're taken care of." "Why? After everything we did?" It was a good question. I'd asked myself the same thing many times. Because I'm not you. I don't abandon people, even when they've hurt me. But don't mistake this for forgiveness or reconciliation. It's just practical support for an elderly woman who needs help. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. Too little, too late. That was the theme of my parents' final years. Every attempt at connection, every expression of regret, came decades after it would have mattered. They'd spent their power when they had it, and now, powerless, they wanted mercy. I gave them basic care, but I couldn't give them absolution. That wasn't mine to grant. David and I grew closer in the years following our father's death. He understood the complex mixture of obligation and resentment, the way family ties could bind without providing warmth. We didn't dwell on the past, but we acknowledged it. We built a relationship as adults, separate from our shared childhood trauma. Margaret lived another 5 years, declining slowly in a care facility I paid for. I visited occasionally, always brief, always maintaining emotional distance. She'd ask about my life, and I'd share surface details. She'd try to offer advice or guidance, and I'd politely redirect. She never stopped trying to be the mother she thought she should have been, but she never became the mother I'd actually needed. When she died, I felt relief more than grief. Relief that the complicated dance of managed contact was over. Relief that I no longer had to navigate the tension between human decency and justified anger. Relief that the chapter was finally, completely closed. At her funeral, even smaller than Thomas's, I gave a brief eulogy. I spoke about her as she was flawed, controlling, concerned with appearances, but also human, struggling with her own limitations. I didn't sugarcoat or martyrize. I presented the truth plainly, respectfully. Some of the elderly attendees looked uncomfortable, but David nodded his approval. Honesty, even in death, mattered more than performance. Afterward, going through her belongings, I found boxes of photos. Me as a child, as a teenager, carefully labeled and preserved. She'd kept every school achievement, every certificate, every marker of my success. Even after disowning me, she'd held on to these artifacts of the daughter she'd rejected. It was pathetic and human all at once, unable to love me as I was, but unable to completely let go either. I kept a few photos for Olivia, gave some to David, donated the rest. No need to preserve the shrine Margaret had built to her own failure as a parent. The past was the past. It had shaped me, yes, but it didn't define me anymore. Looking back now, from the distance of middle age, I can see the entire arc clearly. I was raised in a house where love was conditional, where approval had to be earned through constant performance, where any deviation from the prescribed path meant rejection. My pregnancy at 18 revealed the truth I'd been too young to see. Their love had never been love at all. It had been control dressed up as care, manipulation masked as guidance. Their rejection, brutal as it was, freed me. Not immediately, it nearly destroyed me. But ultimately, it forced me to build my own foundation, to define my own worth, to create my own family based on genuine connection rather than obligation. I learned that blood doesn't make family, that biology doesn't create belonging, that the people who show up matter more than the people who share your DNA. The military taught me discipline, purpose, structure. It gave me a framework to channel my pain into achievement, my anger into ambition. I rose through the ranks not because I was exceptional, but because I was determined. Every promotion was proof that my parents' judgment had been wrong. I wasn't the failure they'd predicted. I was someone they had to look up to, quite literally, when they finally came crawling back. Olivia grew into an extraordinary young woman, confident, compassionate, strong. She attended an excellent university, excelled in her studies, built relationships based on mutual respect rather than need or obligation. She became everything I'd hoped for, not because I'd controlled her or demanded perfection, but because I'd loved her unconditionally and given her space to become herself. She was proof that the cycle could be broken, that children raised with genuine love grow differently than children raised with conditional approval. My career reached heights I'd never imagined that night when I stood on my parents' porch, locked out and alone. General Bennett commanded respect not through fear or authority, but through competence and integrity. People followed me because they trusted me, because I'd proven myself, because I led by example rather than decree. The leadership principles I'd learned, so different from my parents' controlling style, created loyalty and devotion instead of resentful compliance. The estate I'd purchased, the one where my parents had stood at the gate looking shocked and diminished, represented something beyond wealth or status. It represented autonomy, self-determination, the freedom to build a life on my own terms. No one could throw me out anymore. No one could take it away. I'd built it myself, through years of discipline and hard work, and it was mine. My parents' final years taught me a difficult truth. Some people never change, never grow, never develop the capacity for genuine self-reflection. Thomas and Margaret died believing they'd been right to reject me, that they'd simply been unlucky in how things turned out. They never understood that conditional love isn't love. They never grasped that you can't demand respect and loyalty while offering neither in return. They learned consequences, but they never learned lessons. And I learned to be okay with that. I spent years wanting them to understand, to acknowledge, to apologize in a way that showed real comprehension of the harm they'd caused. When that never came, I had to accept that closure doesn't always arrive externally. Sometimes you have to create it internally, deciding for yourself that you're finished waiting for someone else's growth. The key lesson, the one I tried to pass to Olivia and anyone else who'd listen, was this: you cannot tolerate conditional love and expect to thrive. Conditional love is a slow poison that teaches you to betray yourself, to sacrifice your authentic self for approval you'll never fully earn. Real love, the kind worth having, doesn't come with terms and conditions. It doesn't withdraw when you make mistakes or fail to meet expectations. It doesn't require you to perform or pretend or diminish yourself to make someone else comfortable. My parents taught me what love wasn't. I had to learn what love actually was from others, from Olivia, from military comrades who had my back in crisis, from friends who showed up when I needed help, from mentors who invested in my success without requiring my submission. Real love builds up, supports, allows room for failure and growth. It doesn't demand perfection or punish humanity. Justice, I learned, isn't always dramatic or obvious. There was no moment of revenge, no scene where I publicly humiliated my parents or made them suffer as they'd made me suffer. Justice came quietly, in the form of a life well lived, success achieved despite their predictions, happiness claimed without their permission. They'd tried to write my story, to define my limits, to control my future. I'd rewritten the entire narrative. When they stood at my gate, speechless at the title, General Bennett, that was justice. When they saw the life I'd built, the daughter I'd raised, the respect I'd earned, that was justice. When they died knowing they'd thrown away something precious and irretrievable, that was justice. Not the violent, dramatic justice of revenge stories, but the quiet, profound justice of consequences meeting choices. Today, I stand in my office, looking at photos on the wall. Olivia at her college graduation, beaming with pride. My military unit, faces of people I'd served with and led. Friends from different phases of life. These are my family, chosen and earned rather than assigned by biology. These relationships, built on mutual respect and genuine care, matter more than any genetic connection ever could. There's one photo that people always ask about, me at 18, pregnant and defiant, taken just weeks after my parents expelled me. I look young, scared, but there's determination in my eyes that predicted everything that came after. I keep it as a reminder. The girl in that photo survived impossible circumstances and built something remarkable. She deserves honor and recognition. I am General Bennett. I earned that title through discipline, sacrifice, and relentless determination. I raised a daughter who loves fiercely and sets healthy boundaries. I built a career based on integrity and competence. I created a life that speaks louder than my parents' words ever did. Their judgment of me was wrong. Their rejection of me was their loss. Their conditional love was never love at all. My story isn't unique. Countless people navigate family dysfunction, parental rejection, conditional love masked as care. What matters isn't the particulars of betrayal, but the response to it. You can let rejection define you, diminish you, destroy you. Or you can use it as a catalyst for transformation, as fuel for building something better. I chose transformation. Not because I was strong, I wasn't, not at first. But because I refused to accept my parents' version of my story. They'd written me off as a failure, a disappointment, a cautionary tale. I rewrote the script entirely, created a narrative they couldn't have imagined, achieved success they deemed impossible for someone like me. The lesson I want Olivia to carry forward, the one I share with anyone who'll listen, is simple but profound. You are not defined by how others treat you. You are defined by how you respond to that treatment. My parents tried to break me, to prove I was worthless without their approval. Instead, they freed me to discover my own worth, independent of their judgment. Boundaries are not cruelty. They are survival. When I maintained strict limits with my parents, people sometimes criticized me as cold or unforgiving. But boundaries protected me from repeating destructive patterns, from accepting crumbs of affection and calling it love, from sacrificing my well-being for people who'd proven they didn't value it. Boundaries allowed me to exist safely in proximity to people who'd caused me harm. Forgiveness is personal and optional. I never fully forgave my parents, and that's okay. Forgiveness isn't required for healing or peace. I found peace through acceptance, accepting what happened, accepting who they were, accepting that some relationships can't be repaired. That acceptance freed me more than forced forgiveness ever could have. Success is the best response to rejection. Not success driven by revenge or bitterness, but success built on self-worth, determination, and refusing to internalize someone else's limiting beliefs. Every achievement in my life was proof that my parents were wrong about me. I didn't succeed despite them, I succeeded despite them, and that made all the difference. As I approach the later stages of my career, preparing eventually to retire, I reflect on the full journey. From dutiful daughter to discarded teenager to single mother to General Bennett. From begging for conditional approval to defining my own worth. From accepting others' limitations on my potential to shattering every limit they'd tried to impose. It's been a long road, often brutal, sometimes beautiful, always mine. My parents are gone now, buried in plots I paid for, remembered by few. They lived small lives defined by fear and control, and they died having lost most of what they'd valued. They destroyed their relationship with both children, alienated extended family, squandered their social standing. They clung to appearances and lost substance, demanded respect and received indifference. I am not them. That's the core truth I hold. I am not cruel, not controlling, not conditional in my love. I am not small or fearful or obsessed with others' opinions. I built something different, something better, something real. I am General Bennett, yes, but more importantly, I am Olivia's mother. I am a leader people trust. I am a friend people value. I am a woman who survived being discarded and built something worth keeping. The guard's question that day, appointment for General Bennett, represents everything my parents failed to see. They looked at an 18-year-old pregnant girl and saw failure. They couldn't imagine she'd become someone who needed appointments, who commanded respect, who built an estate they'd one day stand outside of, speechless and diminished. Their failure of imagination matched their failure of love. I don't hate them anymore. Hate requires emotional investment, and they don't deserve mine. I feel a distant sadness for lives poorly lived, for potential wasted on protecting an image that never mattered, for love withheld that could have transformed everything. But mostly, I feel nothing. They are my parents biologically, but strangers emotionally. Their story ended. Mine continues. And that continuation, that forward movement, that building, that growing is the real victory. Not because I beat them or proved them wrong, though I did both. But because I refused to let their rejection become my identity. I am not the daughter who is disowned. I am General Bennett, mother of Olivia, leader, friend, survivor, builder. I am defined by what I created, not by what was done to me. That's the legacy I leave. You can survive impossible betrayal. You can thrive after devastating rejection. You can build a life so full and meaningful that the people who discarded you become footnotes in your story rather than the story itself. It requires strength, boundaries, determination, and the courage to define your own worth regardless of others' judgments. I am no longer the daughter who begged for approval at that dining room table, who sacrificed her authentic self for conditional acceptance. I am the woman who stood at the gate of her own estate, watched her parents realize who she'd become, and felt nothing but calm certainty. I am enough. I always was. They just couldn't see it, and their blindness was their tragedy, not mine. My life speaks louder than their words ever did. That's not revenge. That's justice. That's peace. That's victory. And it's mine. That's my story. I'm not asking for sympathy, I'm asking you to back yourself the way I finally did. If this resonated, like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that boundaries aren't cruelty, they're survival. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. Questions for you. Have you ever been cut off or shamed by family for a life choice? What happened next? Where did you draw the first real boundary, and how did people react? If your parents showed up years later asking to reconnect, what terms would you set? What would you tell your 18-year-old self about love, loyalty, and self-respect? Do you believe limited contact can work after a deep betrayal, or is no contact the only path? What does justice look like for you? An apology, accountability, or simply living well? If you're in the thick of it right now, what's one step you can take this week to protect your peace?